the truth is anxiety is contagious. It's like a virus. And typically, unless there is a healthy leader in the room, the most anxious voice actually gets the floor and controls the room. So you've been in those things, like you get in a meeting, like, what are we going to do? So-and-so said, what are we going to do? And people start going crazy. So one of the things that Ed Friedman says is he got from a trauma surgeon. He said, when you're a trauma surgeon, a patient flatlines on the table. What's the very first thing you do? And the surgeon said the very first thing a good trauma surgeon does is check their own pulse.
This is BetterWealth with Caleb Williams. Jeremy, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, man. I'm really glad to be here.
So the story and how we met was we connected, I'll say, the week before everything got crazy in this country. It was the week that the NBA decided to postpone, and Trump put the travel ban on, and everyone's freaking out. Toilet paper's disappearing. Yep. And we're at a workshop and learning how to get our messages out in the world. And the cool thing about you is I didn't know much of your story. I just know you just made a huge impression on how you led and how you showed up and how you communicated. And then I found out afterwards that you led a big church and what you're doing and what you're doing now. And I'm like, Better Wealth, this show is all about helping people rise up and live a more intentional life. And I would say that most people on this show have a tendency to talk about money, because if you can get this money thing right, you can be a more intentional person. And I would love for you to touch on that, but I'm more excited to talk about the wisdom of leadership and the outlook that you're having in this crazy time. And I just know that this is going to be an encouraging conversation, because I've talked to you a couple times and I've just left so encouraged. And that's why I have the show, is because I don't want to just keep that to myself. So thank you for being on here.
Yeah, absolutely, man. That's what I feel like my calling and my why is really related to that, and what my business is about. So, man, it's awesome to be part of this and to be on with you.
Awesome. Why don't you give your overview origin story? When people ask, like, where do you want me to begin? I'm like, why don't we begin with how your parents met? We don't have to go down that far, but I love to hear the origin, because I think that gives a lot of context on who the person is. And then let's get into how the people listening to this, how we can rise up and really not be fearful, but make decisions in a really clear way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, man, that's super important. Like, one of the things that I talk to people about and talk to myself about and my clients about is the fact that you have to deal with your past, or you're going to be defined by it. And because so many leaders they're driven by things that they don't fully understand within themselves, and most of it relates to our past. So for me, I grew up in rural South Carolina. I grew up in a situation where there were some substantial difficulties. I was the first person in my family to ever go to college. The fact that I feel like by God's grace, He rescued me from all kinds of different things, but that also created a number of things in me that led to a very difficult leadership experience. So, what part of what happens in our lives, sometimes the dysfunctions in our lives actually give us success in the world. And so, because I had been sort of taught to be responsible and you have to figure everything out, like, it gave me this great sense of resourcefulness and this great sense of drive and curiosity and independence, and like, man, I'm going to go get them. And I would just blaze through all kinds of things. And that was really great until it wasn't. And at one point, I'd done lots of different stuff in my career, from banking to finance to coaching and consulting to pastoring, and eventually became the senior pastor of a very large church, 6 sites and 6,000 people. And sort of looking around a few years into that and going, man, what is wrong with me? This should be like, everybody I went to school with is like, you've got the dream. You guys are planting churches and globally impacting and we started like 10 nonprofits to address like sex trafficking and poverty. I mean, all kinds of stuff and it was great. We had a world-class team and yet inside, man, I was like burning with like anger and bitterness and loneliness and emptiness and just exhaustion. And I couldn't figure out why for a while. But a lot of it came back to the fact that I had been driven by those things that I picked up in my childhood, and I didn't fully understand, I was living other people's scripts for my life, even though, it's like, hey, I'm helping this person, I'm putting out this fire, and I was very busy, and I was very, and people love that because like, oh, you're competent, you can do this, and they'll start handing you more things, and the more you not only do those things but take the emotional weight and responsibility of them, the more you edge toward burnout, because burnout doesn't actually come from overwork. It comes from you emotionally bearing the burdens that you weren't meant to bear.
Wow, man, that's a really powerful story, and it gives a lot of context of like where you've come from. And it was interesting. So just going back to what you said about burnout, it's not by overwork, it's about bearing things that, can you just repeat that?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of times we think, hey, a burnout and which is, I mean, burnout is huge. Like, it doesn't matter where you look, like Google it sometime, you'll see like Forbes articles and Harvard Business Review articles about burnout of leaders in the workplace. And it's one of the things I'm passionate about preventing and helping people recover from, because I went through it. And yeah, we think, well, it's because you're working, too many hours, and that does contribute. But we all know, like, when you're working in the thing that you're meant to do and you're passionate about, you don't roll over and die. You're like, I just want to keep doing that. You know what I mean? You're excited about it. And not that you of course you have to get right sleep and diet and boundaries and all that kind of stuff. But what happens is the burnout comes because we start taking on the responsibilities, especially emotionally, that other people are supposed to have. So I have this exercise I do with clients called 2 circles that saved my life. And they really are the 2 circles that saved my life. And so the outer circle is concerns, and the inner circle is responsibility. And I even have like a little like worksheet resource that you can work through. I'm happy to shoot you that if you want it. But but the idea is, like, we all have concerns, but then we have this inner thing of responsibility. So I'm concerned about, like, what my wife's emotional reaction will be to the fact that I don't want to do what she wants to do or whatever it is. Right. But I'm not responsible for her emotional reaction. So I'm concerned about what my employees, my team, how they're performing or why this thing isn't getting done. But I'm not taking on the emotional burden of bearing that for them. I'm helping them get there. I'm helping them do what they're called to do. Because when I overfunction, which is what I learned to do in all of life, like, when I overfunction, the only way you can overfunction in the system, whether that's a family or a business or whatever, is for other people to underfunction. So it's like the classic thing, right? Of your, like, the mom who's like complaining to their teenager, why don't you clean your room? Why don't you make your bed? And then they leave, and then she just goes and makes their bed for them every day. So see, he gets to keep underfunctioning because she's overfunctioning. And the same thing happens in the workplace.
All right. So
That's probably much longer than you wanted. Sorry.
Well, no, I love this, man. And also that resource that you said, like, would love for that resource to be included. If that will be in the show notes, we'll make sure that gets it there. Cause I really appreciate you just like sharing that, because burnout, like, I haven't had anyone on the show that's talking about burnout. And I think it shows up differently for people, but you have, I mean, and again, you look at the marriages that are falling apart, you look at the people that are not being fulfilled, you're like, there's different factors. And I'm not going to say you understand that or I understand that fully, but it's so super interesting, because as you're talking, I'm like, man, going back to what we all do, intentional living is better wealth. And I don't care how much money you have, Jeremy, if you're not able to live an intentional life, you're not wealthy. And I love how the work that you're doing and the passion that you have is really getting people figured that out before you go figure everything else out. So talk to me about if someone asks you off the street, hey, what do you do? How do you answer that? Number one, talk to me a little bit more about what you do, but like you went from everyone seeing you being a massive success. What happened after that? You said that you hit some walls. What did that actually look like? And what are you currently doing now?
Yeah. As I started running into the walls, I had to do something I'd never done in my life. And I will often tell people, like, this is maybe the hardest thing I've ever done. And yet it'll seem like, well, it should be the easiest thing. But I'd never had to ask for help. I had never had to say, I can't do this or figure this out. And it was so frustrating and so humbling because I had been able to figure everything else out, manage every other crisis and fire. And yet, when you put out a lot of fires, what happens is you start to get burned. And I had to say, man, I'm toast, and I need to step back and take a rest. And so ended up taking a sabbatical, but then just saying, like, hey, I feel like God's calling me to, like, totally kind of reorient my life. I spent about a year just doing that, a year being uber present with my wife and kids, a year doing a lot of study and research and reflection and journaling and prayer and counseling and coaching and all kinds of stuff. And I felt like through that whole thing and my friends and people around me that God just really recreated me fully, like, in terms of my clarity, my focus, my leadership, my family, my relationships, all that stuff. And that gift of recreation is what the gift I want to give to leaders and businesses. And it's the passion that I have. And so now I help leaders and businesses get started, get healthy, get unstuck. I often say that I help people go from being busy to being productive, because we all know what it is to be busy, right?
Yeah.
And we're like busy. You come home, you're like, I'm so tired. I was so busy all day. You're like, but what did I actually get done?
Yeah. Oh,
and
man.
that's a horrible feeling to have, man. I used to hate that feeling, to feel like worked my tail off all day, but what actually happened, and actually what I kind of say is, like, I like to help leaders be lazy. And that it doesn't mean that you're actually being lazy, but when you're in your zone of genius, when you're doing, what you talk about it, right, as the why, what am I here for? What's my purpose? And how you need money to fund that, to push that impact forward, to push that message forward. That is what we want, right? And so when leaders aren't healthy, when they're driven by the wrong things, when whatever, it's like it's shortcut. Just like if you mess up your whole financial thing and now you can't do that anymore, yeah. The same thing happens in your inner life. And so what I help do is build transformative leaders and thriving cultures. And those are the things that I really work in. So a lot of times I go into toxic workplace cultures and flip those into trust cultures. And I work with, leaders. And we all know, like, as leaders go the organization and the impact and the why and all that stuff. And so if you think about the leaders that that have been the most transformational, inspirational, impactful in your life and in the world and that kind of stuff, how powerful they are. They're very rare, but those are the kind of leaders that I help build.
So again, it's like there's like 10 things I want to say every time you talk, as it relates to just going back to, I think everyone like woke up when you were like, oh, the difference between being busy and productive. Like that hit me. I'm like, oh man, like I'm always busy. I don't know how many times I'm productive though. So that's a piece that I think is so key. And then the idea of even recreating yourself. I think there's so many people, whether you're in business or not, and I want you to speak to this. When you say recreate, in other words, like how can someone listening to this take what you do in your specialty and how can they apply it to their life today? And then let's talk about toxic work culture, because there's a lot there's a lot of that going on. I'm wondering if you see a correlation between toxic work culture and toxic family culture. Because there's a lot of families listening to this. So first of all, let's talk about recreate. How can someone recreate themselves, whether they're an executive or not? And then let's talk about toxic workplaces.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would say the starting premise is no one can recreate themselves.
Okay.
If you mean by yourself, right? I'm not saying you meant that, but I think it's an important point to say that, you know, we we're created for community and relationship. As I see it, and I say everybody needs a few roles. You need a team, right? And you can build this team with having zero employees. It's not about who's on your staff or your culture, but everybody needs a friend. And I'm talking about a good friend. Like if you go back and look at 2 Kings 4, I believe it is, where Solomon becomes king, and he appoints a cabinet, what we call a cabinet, and one of the cabinet positions is chief friend to the king. And that was the wisest king that ever lived, right? At least to that point. He went downhill shortly thereafter. But you need a friend, you need a mentor, you need a coach, you need a counselor, you need those kinds of roles in your life. And so that's the key thing, is having. Yeah, go ahead.
And also, I'll just say, when you know how people say like you are the 5 people who you spend time with.
Yep.
Are you saying like yes, and we should be intentional with maybe the different roles within those 5 people?
Do you mean who those 5 people are in those roles? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes. So I'm talking about, so who you spend time with, I think, is super important. I think we both agree on that.
Yeah.
But then you're talking about like a friend, mentor, like, are there different roles within the people that you should surround your life with, that you should sort of have someone in each category?
Yeah, in my opinion, yes. Like I even have a little wheel that says like, here are the roles that every leader kind of needs. And so like you have to, in my opinion, I'm not saying at all times you need to be doing all of those things because you don't want to overwhelm yourself, but you need to intentionally go, okay, who's my mentor or mentors? And some of them, frankly, some of your mentors need to be dead. In other words, like that great men and women who lived in the past who have passed that down, and then some need to be alive. And some can be specific, right? Like, mentoring me in this like particular area of my like a marriage or whatever, and some can be like business, and then yeah, being intentional about having a coach, a counselor, those kinds of people on your team, because that's the path to greatest growth. One of the things you talk about, right, is how using money to leverage your greatest asset, investing in whatever the why is that you have, right? So driving your business forward, your message forward that you've been given, and that's the same kind of reason that people invest in me in their life, because they want to drive that forward. And I could give you a bunch of stories about that and how that looks, but that's the piece that really helps, people catapult to another level of success, both personally and professionally, which is what I'm passionate about. And I'm not sure if I answered all your questions there. Probably lost some.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. And the first time when you talked, I was like, I didn't know King Solomon had those different people on their cabinet, but it makes me just like take an audit of myself. It's like, okay, who's in my life, who's speaking into my life, and there might be some different roles, and some people it shouldn't all be business. Like, it's powerful to have some encouraging friends. And I just got a text the other day by someone who's a friend of mine who's just pure encouragement, and I just like that shows up in my life in really powerful ways. So thank you for that. Let's talk about toxic work cultures and toxic family cultures and what makes something toxic, because you've said it a couple times, and I feel like there's a lot of this going on in our homes and our businesses. So what are some of the key things that you see And and I also appreciate you saying that you can't recreate yourself, like that you can't be the sole person. So what do you do when you see that? What are the best ways to get away from that?
Yeah, on the toxic culture side.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So it's a pernicious problem. What I'm going to say is, I think the best way to explain it is, everyone should adopt let's call it like a systems view of life. We're all involved in different systems. You have a family system, we have relational systems, we have business systems. And the principle, whether you're looking at it from culture or biology or whatever, right, is homeostasis. And so when I talked before, like the way that I learned to overfunction was by other people underfunctioning and me being sucked into that. So that's a system. And when you change one element of it, the other ones react to that, right? So when I go, I'm going to be healthy now and I'm going to have boundaries around this, the other people in the system will sabotage that. It's not like a intentional, let's see how, but they are going, how do we get back to this homeostasis where I was functioning like this, because it's not comfortable to change. We all know that. So in the workplace, it's usually because you have toxic cultures, because you have usually a toxic leader who approaches with what I call, and I got this from Ed Friedman, who was an amazing, highly understudied, undervalued thinker in this area, but we approach with an anxious presence. And so the greatest gift that any leader can give their family, their business, is a non-anxious presence. So I say presence is better than technique. And when you have an organization and it's driven by data over decisiveness. Now you need data, but like that paralysis around data, when it's driven by blame, like, well, it's the sales team's fault, it's the marketing team's fault. It's never, you see blame, you see this broken trust, lack of trust. You see all those things. That's a toxic culture, and it's a result of, we think of anxiety only as worry, but it's really more than that. It's all this energy inside that we don't know what to do with. And so when I show up to my wife and kids and I'm all worked up from the day of getting rejected in this and not knowing what to do with that and feeling uncertain over here and whatever, and I come in with all that energy, my kids just do just the normal kid stuff, like spill a glass of water or whatever, my reaction goes like, wow. And then I go, my goodness, I just reacted completely out of proportion. Like if you're self-aware enough to be like, why did I react that? Well, because I'm bringing all that baggage in. Yeah. And so if you don't have healthy leaders, then they're bringing that baggage in and they're innervating the workplace with so much stuff. And everybody feels that sense of, I don't know what to do. I'm not clear. And how do I get here? And how do I manage that? And how do I put this out? And everybody's running frantically rather than actually achieving the mission of the organization. And the longer that goes, the more broken it gets, the more people burn out, the more anger and fear take root. And it has devastating financial and not only personal. It's not just about like, hey, how do we help make people happy? It's about, even your bottom line. I can show you all the studies of ROI on all this stuff, and it's pretty huge.
Can you talk to me about the difference? So if there's some toxic workplaces, or if you see yourself being reactionary, what is the next step? Is it taking a step back and saying, I'm going to be self-aware and going in and approaching it like that? Is it self-awareness? Is it like, if you're sitting across the table from a leader that wants to be better, that wants to rise up and be a more present leader, what questions do you ask them? Where do you begin? Because I'm fascinated by that. And I see that in my own life, Jeremy, and how reactionary I am. And I can see that bleed into all the other things that I do.
Yeah, it's a good question. And the truth is anxiety is contagious. It's like a virus. And typically, unless there is a healthy leader in the room, the most anxious voice actually gets the floor and controls the room. So you've been in those things, like you get in a meeting, like, what are we going to do? So-and-so said, what are we going to do? And people start going crazy. So one of the things that Ed Friedman says is he got from a trauma surgeon. He said, when you're a trauma surgeon, a patient flatlines on the table. What's the very first thing you do? And the surgeon said the very first thing a good trauma surgeon does is check their own pulse. And
really?
yes. And it's not as much like, not literally like he's like sitting there holding his fingers, like counting his pulse, but taking that first breath and going, I'm not just going to rush in and start, doing things to this patient. I'm going to take a breath and go, am I in a place where I'm able to make a good logical decision? Because we don't make good decisions out of anxiety and fear. Our brain gets narrowed down and we lose access to our prefrontal cortex, and we can't make the kinds of decisions we need to make. So, so the place where I usually start is I start with getting feedback from, and I have a specific process that I use, right, to get feedback and to get people talking and to understand how they're experiencing the leader and how they're experiencing the workplace and the culture. But with a leader, I sit down and I have them go through a bit of their story and their past. And you'd be surprised how many high-powered CEOs who are 50 years old have never had someone sit and listen to them for an hour, 2 hours, and pull that stuff out. So, and I had one guy, just recently, and I was going through this whole thing with him. He's like, man, why are you asking me all these questions? I want to grow my business. I want to fix my team. I got problems. Like, you're asking me all these questions. And I'm like, hey, just trust me for 30 more minutes. Right. And dude, we get like an hour and 15 minutes into our first coaching conversation, and he stops, sits back, and starts laughing. And I said, man, what's going on? Why are you laughing? And he's like, because everything has been so complex just suddenly got so clear. And I realized like what's blocking me is not technical competence, not inability to figure out strategy and all that kind of stuff. It is this fact that you've drawn together all these themes, and I've got this underlying rage that's just simmering underneath me that's blocking everything else. And he emailed me a few days later and said, man, that one conversation, he said, I've done over a year of counseling, medication, mentoring, and that 1 2-hour session gave me more clarity and direction and freedom than I'd had from all that combined, man. And I started crying. I was like, man, that's what God's made me to do. And to see that, go like, okay, that's the kind of stuff that's underneath that we need help pulling out so that we can lead in a healthy way. And then he was able to go and achieve those things, right? But do it in a way that was healthy, wasn't blocked up anymore.
It's funny because I relate to what I teach of like getting clarity on where you want to go before you get in the car or before you start your wealth strategy. It's same thing that goes, it's like, yeah, I'm the kind of leader that's like, I want to build a business. I want to build a team. I want to figure out the funnels. I want to do the marketing. And you're like, okay. And make sure that you don't go up the wrong tree and figure out that you're in the wrong forest, or maybe we're focused on the wrong issue. You think it's a marketing issue, but it's actually a scaling issue. And it's powerful when you can take a step back and listen. And it is true. It's when you are leading an organization, it's lonely. And it just, I want the people listening to this, if you're listening to this, I want to encourage you 2 things. Number 1, find someone that you can talk to with no agenda. And then number 2 is be that person for someone else. And man, that alone, like, is encouraging. I want to ask you one more leadership question, then I want to switch over to wealth. Leadership, like level 5 leadership. Jim Collins talks about it. There's a million books on leadership. What's your example of what the goal is for a leader? What can I do to build myself up? And then the people listening to this, I don't care if you're in business or if you're leading your house or whatever you're doing, leadership's a strong calling. I believe it's influence. How do you, when you're across the table from someone and talking about leadership, what kind of conversations do you have? And how would you define what leadership is, like what we're headed for? And what can people do to make sure that they're stepping up and to what they've been called to do?
And those are huge questions.
and do that in the next 3 minutes. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah. Man, it's what I think, obviously leadership has become this buzzword, and I talk to a lot of people who are not living their full potential because they believe that leadership is defined in their minds as this, let's say it's this super charismatic, strong, just, type A driven, like that's what a leader is. And that is a particular kind of leader. But I believe all of us are called to be leaders in some way. And the very first and the hardest aspect of leadership is self-leadership. There's a proverb that says, better is the man who can rule his own spirit than he who can take a city. If you can lead yourself, then you can lead other people. And you can actually get other people to follow you without leading yourself. But in the end, it will go poorly if you don't do those things. And so I start talking to people about, what I call the oxygen mask principle, right? You have to put your mask on before you start assisting and helping other people, or else you won't be able to. You'll, like what happened to me, right? I had to step down because I could no longer do it. How much would it have been worth if I had taken care of myself in that way, so that I could have kept going at a healthy pace and growing and moving that forward? Almost, you can't even quantify that value. And so I tell people to start with, Jesus said, like, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And we have this idea that that's selfish, but it's not. So we need to when I'm focused, when I have like my morning routines down, my intentionality, my mindset, I know what my why is and my clarity. So I have a process called Recreate Leaders, right? And we start with the core of who we are, and we build a compass, and we build clarity, and then we build connections, and then we do competence. So it's holistic. And so that idea is getting yourself right. It's kind of like you said, you've got to start right before we start working on like what your rate of return is going to be. Let's work on where you're trying to get to, or else you drive 100 miles, like, Dumb and Dumber in the wrong direction.
Yeah. And way to answer that concisely, because I gave you a lot to it was a big question. And so 100% agree. Now, what I want to do is I want to switch over. You talked about your story. You talked about burnout, talked about toxic workplace. You talked about being self-aware, talked about leadership. Now let's talk about that in the frame of better wealth. So number one, I would love to hear your definition of better wealth. Like, what does better wealth mean to you? And then from a person listening to this, whether you're a business owner, whether like you're an investor, whether you're just getting started in life, like what kind of financial advice do you give? And I know this may or may not be your forte. You are a CFO for a couple companies, so you know a thing or two about money. So I'm just wondering, from a leadership perspective and the paradigm that you have, how that translates into how you view money.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I might have told you before. A lot of times I sit down with the client first and say, like, I start saying that kind of like why question, right? What are you trying to do? A lot of like, man, I want to retire on this age. I want to be able to accomplish these business goals, grow my business X%, scale to this, do all that kind of stuff. And I say, man, that's awesome. And then I stop and say, if you got all those things, what would that do for you? What would that do for you if, and who would you become? Like, who would you be if you had those things? And then they get to reflect a little bit more, and they start to go, well, lots of different answers, right? But it might be like, well, then I'd have freedom to really be with my wife and kids and spend time with them and that kind of stuff. And I go, okay, so now we're starting to get to the goal under the goal. But guess what? The way you're pursuing it right now, right, is awesome. You want that, but guess what? In 20 years, when you want that thing to happen, your kids are gone and grown, and then they're singing like "Cats in the Cradle" song to because they don't know who dad is anymore. And so I say, if that's your why, then how do we work your life now where you can enjoy and achieve that part now as you build that? Because so better wealth is connected to money, but it's not money. You can be wealthy regardless of your financial decision. Wealth is a choice and a habit, and it's about who you are and who you're made to be. So money fuels that. So wealth is, in a lot of ways, in my opinion, the clarity and ability and the time to live the life that you're called to live, and to be the person and to have the impact that you're called to have. And we need money to fuel that. Money is not what we're trying to get. Money is what we use to fuel that mission forward.
What financial strategies do you have in your life based off of, like, what is your goal number one? Like, I love that you gave the big picture of BetterWealth. What's BetterWealth mean to Jeremy? And then what are you doing today to go on that journey?
Yeah, I tell people to call you.
I didn't pay him to say that, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, he didn't. But no, I seriously, since I've gotten to know you, I want to refer people to you, because I know what your process is, how you care for people, and I know financially that your process is sound as well. And so what I say is it's very similar to what you say. Like, how do you use the assets you have to invest in the things that are most valuable? And the thing that's most valuable might not be a 401k or an IRA. But what you do is you allow people to put that money into a system where they can both utilize the money and have the money growing at the same time. That's fantastic. And what I do is say, by what I do, the ROI of what I do, or in your terms, the ROR, the return on result, is huge. Like I did a culture project with a company recently, and just in the first 3 months, we were able to reduce their turnover 30%, which we estimate saved them $250,000 to $300,000. Now, what the contract to me was, I don't know, something like $40,000. So anytime, if I told you, if you give me 40,000, I'll give you 300. Would you take that deal every day?
Yeah. Where do I sign? Yeah, I like that.
But we're all worked up about like, trying to get, an 8% return on something. And it's like, man, what? Yeah. So that piece of investing in that which is most valuable and putting forward and pushing your mission, that pushes your mission forward.
I appreciate that. And I think that's just, I think it's helpful to hear that from different people, because it's so obvious. And yet I see what most people are doing, and just asking the question, why? It's like, why are you doing that? It's because that's what we've been taught, and that's okay. That's a good answer. But I want to give people the permission to ask questions and really make different choices, because last I checked, you have one life. I don't know if that's changed, but like I want people to wake up and really to that reality. So two more questions. One's an open-ended question. One's less of an open-ended question. Anything else you want to leave with our audience with, as far as an encouragement as it relates to their life, their family, their potential marriage or business? Like I know one thing, like one word I have for you is you're an encouragement. Like, I just feel so encouraged when I get to talk to you. So any piece of encouragement that you want to leave the BetterWealth Nation with?
I think, man, so many things come to mind, but I would say that wherever you are, whether you've been wildly successful or terribly failed, whether you've made great financial investments or not, whether you're at the top of an organization or at the bottom, whether you're just learning to lead yourself, leading a family, or leading a massive organization, I would say you are not alone, and you're not alone. There are people in the world that will listen to you, love you, like you said, without an agenda, and so you don't have to do it alone. And I would say that it's really personal for me, because some of the things that I most needed in my most painful times of my life, I didn't feel like were there. And so I would just say to everyone, ask ask the question who over how, and find someone to do that. And the fact is usually the thing that we most need is the thing we most fear. And so understand that it's normal that you're going to fear to step into that next place, but it is the thing that you most need.
And going all the way full circle, you asked for help, which is extremely hard for you. And it's my understanding that was one of the first times, and yet you needed that, but you probably feared that. And it's, I love how that your whole story backs that up. I love that, man. The question I end this show is, if this is your last day on earth and you're with the people that you love the most, which I've gotten to meet some of them, your kids, your wife, your closest friends, what would you make sure to talk about during that time with them, and knowing that this was going to be your last conversation?
Man, it's a great question. And I just want to say really quickly that a lot of people go, well, man, that's such a morbid thought. No, it's an incredibly clarifying thought. And in all the best ways, because it goes, man, what's really most important? And why am I not doing it today? If that's what I would do on my last day, why am I not doing it today?
Exactly.
And I would take whatever time I had, like with each individual kid. I have 3, 14, 10, and 8 right now. And I would tell them that I love them, that I'm proud of them, and that they have an eternal Father who loves them even more than I do, and has sent his own Son to die for them. And that the most important thing I could leave them with is ask him to believe that message. And I would say, and then I would spend time with my wife, telling her how much she's meant to me. But the other thing I would do is I would ask them to name anything they wanted to name that seemed like it was a negative impact, a hurtful thing. It could be a word, it could be an action I took, whatever. So that I could hear that and I could ask them, not say I'm sorry because it's different, but to repent and say, will you forgive me? I see what I did. Will you please forgive me for that? Because I would want to leave knowing that I could resolve that for them emotionally and spiritually and personally and relationally. And they have a clear deck to move forward with that.
That's a whole nother podcast, is unforgiveness in your life and the negative effect it has on you and others. I've asked that question to a lot of people, and you're the first person to go that route. Highly respect that, man. And I know that I asked that question not just for you, but for the people listening to that. And you pointed something out. It's like, I asked that because whatever you say, shouldn't your life today align what you would say if it was your last day? So thank you. Jeremy, you're incredible, man. You've given so much. How can people connect with you? And I know that you have some cool things happening in your world. And so if someone's like, I want to learn more about what you're doing, where can people go? And this will be in the show notes, by the way. And then I know we'll also put your resource that you mentioned earlier in the show notes as well. But how can people connect with you, and what's kind of the next step?
Yeah, man, that's great. I have one on forgiveness too, actually, that you might want to see too. But
just load it up. Like, give us your resources, and you'll hit the jackpot coming to the show.
Yeah, man. You come to my website. It's recreate-solutions.com. You can see all about me there. Join. I have a 21-day challenge you can join and get some of those resources and do some other things, but help you progress on that leadership journey. But also, my phone number, my personal cell phone is on there. So because I love to engage with people personally. So you're welcome to send me an email or do any of that stuff, which is all on there. But I'd love for you to call me and say, hey, can you take 15 minutes and just talk to me a little bit about what's going on in my life or something like that? I love that. So I would love for anybody to take advantage and do that as well.
Jeremy, I appreciate you, man. And I'm grateful that you're in my life, and I'm grateful for how you show up and the work that you're doing, because I have a saying about like people being their number one asset. They can also be their number one liability if they don't have their mind and heart and soul right. And I see you in the business of helping building people up so that they can go and impact more people, make more money, have a better relationship with their family. And so, yeah, love that, man. And thank you so much for being on the show.
Man, thank you for having me. It's been great.
Thank you so much for listening to the BetterWealth podcast. It would mean the world to me if you could hit subscribe, leave a review, and share this with the people that you know and love.